What's up, guys? Welcome to the Walk On Warrior podcast, where we prepare young student athletes for next level success. I'm your host, Coach Z. And before we get into our episode here, listen, hey, go ahead, make sure and subscribe to the Walk On Warrior podcast. Oh, that is our overlay. My fault. The Walk On Warrior podcast. Listen, hey, we're dropping content every single week, one podcast at least a week, but we've got a ton of content that we're pushing out. We're just getting started with this thing. And listen, also, hey, shout out Unfair Advantage. Listen, Unfair Advantage Mindset with Coach Mike. He is going to be on our episode today. The Unfair Advantage was created to give elite performers a mental edge in competition, whether it be in sports or in life. Most mental training is watered down or taught by people who have not truly been in your shoes and have never helped others win at an elite level. Listen, that is not the case here. With over 28 years of experience competing, 18 years of experience coaching, and 8 years weaponizing the mindset at the highest levels. Listen, the Coach Mindset Mike, their mission at the Unfair Advantage is to make you their success story. And listen, without further ado, let me get this back on here real quick. What did I just do? Let me see real quick. All right, there we go. And without further ado, listen, we got Mindset Mike in the house. What's going on, Mike? How are you?
I'm doing good, man. Thanks for having me on.
All right. So listen, hey, so like I said, I always like on the Walk On Warrior podcast, I always like to start the podcast off with a little icebreaker. And what I was mentioning to you as we were getting started here, so I am from a little small town off the Oregon coast, and it's a town called Reedsport, Oregon. All right. Reedsport, Oregon is about 15 to 20 minutes away from a small town called Coos Bay, Oregon. And I don't know if you know this, but that is the hometown of Steve Prefontaine.
That's funny. Yeah, that's like my idol as an athlete. So Coos Bay, so you say Coos Bay, right?
Coos Bay.
Yep. Yeah, I when I was in Eugene giving a seminar, I actually stopped by the only thing they have for him, which is his death site, which kind of sucks. But I stopped by there because that was a big inspiration for me, especially in my high school and college years. So small world.
Yeah. Well, what's interesting about Steve is that, and I'm going to give you a funny little story, because my head trap coach in high school was the same age as Steve. And he went to, I can't remember what school in Eugene, or I'm sorry, he went to school in Coos Bay, but my head track coach went to, I think, Springfield. It's somewhere around that Colby Covington area. Well, anyway, what's interesting about that is they would run into each other. Of course, they were in the same league. And a funny story about Steve Prefontaine, you might not know, but when he was a senior in high school, he was a little guy, as everybody, he's little and all this. He's, well, he would beat kids so bad that one time in a race, the last 2 laps, he ran them backwards. And so that was one way to get him recruited to go to University of Oregon. And the true and ultimate underdog story of a guy that was undersized. I think he was only about 5'6", 5'7", 145, 150 pounds, whatever. But kind of a cool thing. I thought that we'd be connected in that aspect, as that's one of the guys that we looked up to coming through. So
it's great.
So listen, let's go ahead. Let's start with a little bit about your backstory and kind of where you are. Kind of break down just a short little version of who you are for the guests.
Sure. I grew up in New York on Long Island. Wrestled my whole life. Played all kinds of sports, but wrestling was my main sport. Was always did really well in school. Enjoyed school for the most part. When I was in high school, graduated, I think, like top 15 in my class. Went on to wrestle and attend the University of Maryland. At that time when I came on, similar to you, the head coaching staff got let go, like en route to me having already committed. Our new staff within 3 years turned us into a top 15 team in the country. We ended up having like 4 All-Americans. I can't remember the highest place that we made in the national tournament, but it went from I'm going to go to school and wrestle to I'm going to go to wrestle and I'm going to wrestle and go to school with the equal amounts of effort. Just because, like I said, I had opportunities to go to other schools, but Maryland was the best place for me to end up in the career path that I wanted to. So I chose to not have a heavy wrestling experience, but it turned into a very heavy wrestling experience, which I'm grateful for, because ultimately the main reason I wrestled in college was because I wanted to be a great coach one day, and I wanted to, if I could be an All-American, or if I could win some matches, but mainly I just wanted to learn at a high level from high level people, and I wasn't ready to stop wrestling, and I love wrestling, so I wanted to continue my career. So wrestled there, and then I graduated, and within 6 months I was in the FBI. So I was in the FBI. I did national security surveillance. I did hostage negotiation, or we call it crisis negotiation. I did research for the behavioral science unit. So if you're familiar with criminal minds, those are the people behind that. I did a lot of really cool auxiliary duties. During that time, I was in Washington, D.C., transferred over to the Houston division. And then during that time, I opened up a wrestling academy. During that time at the wrestling academy, that's when I realized that mindset was ultimately going to be the path that I wanted to take. So the quick story of that is, my first year having a wrestling academy, I had 13 kids in the state finals in a city that was not very good in wrestling, in a state that's not very well known for wrestling. So in Houston, having that many kids do well, we had 13 in the finals. 9 honestly should have won. 5 kind of pooped the bed. And I was really confused because they had the skills, they had the right advice. Like, I would have bet money on them. It shouldn't have been something that was going to be like, I don't know, are they going to win? Like, I would have bet money on those kids, those particular kids that lost. 4 of them, we kind of knew they weren't going to win. But of the ones that I mentioned, like, those kids 100% should have won. They did it. So as a coach, I'm like, I just poured an entire year into these kids, and they just didn't clock into work that day. Like, they just did not wrestle well. They wrestled different than they did all year. Didn't do things and did things that they normally wouldn't do. So I sought out resources. The previous company that I worked for was in their startup phase. So I sought them out and utilized them. Long story short, I ended up starting to coach for them because I really understood their material. Fast forward, I leave my job at the FBI to be their first full-time employee. And then they go from 7 coaches and about 150 clients to 150 coaches and 5,000 clients by the time that I left. So, yeah. So during that time, I got to travel pretty much the world working with some of the best athletes. But I started in the beginning when I wasn't Mindset Mike, literally didn't even have that name. I was just Coach Mike, working with anyone that was willing to get the work in. And I was getting consistent results. It was going really well. Continue to master my craft, realize that I was very good at this. That's why I ended up leaving the FBI 2 years later to pursue it full time. And then, fast forward a couple of years later, I'm working with some of the people you see in the background that are UFC champions, NCAA champions, world champions, Bellator champions. Some, the girl and all the way in the far left, the small picture, she pulled off the biggest upset in women's jiu-jitsu history. That's where I really made my name. And then, in June of this last year, I left that company to work for myself and, essentially create the unfair advantage. So I realized that while I can help everyone, my superpower is helping the top tier of athletes either like get over the hump or they are the number one in the state, country, or the world. How do I help them widen the gap? So that's the goal of the unfair advantage, is to make it feel unfair to compete against you. And, I've helped 20 people beat number one in the country or the world, win 5 college national titles, 10 world championships, and 19 high school state titles. So the lessons that I've learned from that is essentially what I've created to formulate the unfair advantage. So I still get to work with people at all levels. I just spoke at a leadership event for kids in LA this weekend. It's essentially the equivalent of YMCA for wrestling. It's called Beat the Streets. So inner city kids in Los Angeles using wrestling as the vehicle to build life skills, etc. So I speak there twice a year, and I spend a little bit of time in high school sports now, but the majority of my time is spent in college and professional professional sports, and love what I do. I don't go to work every day. I just get to enjoy what I do.
Yeah. Well, and that's the one thing, here at the Walk On Warrior podcast, we talk a lot about, for me, it's three pillars. It's, the academics, it's the mentality, and it's obviously the strength conditioning. But one thing that I think really gets overlooked, especially when, you're a young student athlete, is the mindset, the mentality. And a lot of these kids, when they're growing up, they start off in a somewhat unfair advantage in the fact that they're in a single parent home. And I really talk to that aspect of it because, you don't have that dynamic of two parents, the discipline, you don't have all that teaching. That's your first teacher. And I don't, a lot of kids, then they just start getting caught up in all these other things. They start looking at all these celebrities. They try to fill that gap and that void of not having that other parent. And that creates a situation where, they can go in a couple different directions. And the main thing for me is really just filling that gap with the Walk On Warrior, with the mentality and go in the right direction. So can you speak to that real quick, as far as how a kid is going to overcome that? So a young student athlete, so say he does grow up in a single parent home, but he has a dream of going and becoming a next level student athlete. But there's some things he's dealing with. There's, some trauma at home. There's all these different things. Talk about the mindset of pursuing this thing, right? From the mental side of it.
Sure. I think you can look at it as adversity can define us, or we can define how it affects us. I'm sure you can find a large number of professional athletes that grew up in a similar circumstance. I'm sure you could also find a large number of people that turn to gangs, drugs, and alcohol, dropped out of school. So, we don't have to be defined by the circumstances that we have. Does it make it more difficult? Yes, which is why the people that overcome those difficulties tend to do great things. There's plenty of some of the best athletes on planet Earth that grew up in similar circumstances. So we can look at it as an obligation to deal with, like problems to solve, or we can look at it as, this is my circumstance. Like, it could be a challenge to overcome, or like, this is my circumstance. Like, whether it's good or bad, I have to deal with it. There's plenty of rich kids that, don't take advantage of their opportunities. There's plenty of kids that don't grow up in a great home with great circumstances that take advantage of every opportunity. So I think it's not letting yourself be defined by the circumstances, but making your own definition for those circumstances for yourself. So no matter what your circumstances are, even if you have no money, you could find a way. You have no money to afford all the training, all the this, all of that. There's all the movies and the videos of fictional and non-fictional real athletes that did as much as they could on their own. I mean, I think if anybody watches, the Venus and Serena Williams story, like, they didn't have in the beginning, right? Like, they didn't have the ability to afford all of the training that came into their life later on. Like, dad's essentially was like, my girls are going to be great, and we're going to wake up at 4:30 in the morning and practice till 9 p.m. at night until they become great. And let's say you don't have a parent figure. There's a million people that have done those sort of things on their own. So I think the moral of the story is that, like, don't look at your circumstances as a limiting factor. Your circumstances are your circumstances. So you can make the most of them or not. So you can come from a 2-parent home with all the funds and the resources in the world and still piss away your talent. You can come from a single parent home, or you could be raised by your grandmother with no biological parents present, and you could become one of the best athletes in the planet of your sport. So I think oftentimes we tend to play victim with ourselves, with all the things that we don't have, instead of realizing the things that we do have. And even if you don't have much, you've got more than others.
Yeah, and growing up too, you think about it in a kid situation like that, whether they're elementary school, middle school, going into high school. Talk about your surroundings. So you're in a situation where you have a parent that's working, that's busy, that's going and doing all these different things. But talk about your surroundings. You're pursuing this. You want to go and pursue the next level, be a collegiate level athlete. Excuse me. And but there's different directions that you could be pulled, right? You can be pulled with this group, this crowd. They're negative, they're bad people, whatever. So talk a little bit about your circles and who you're around and how that affects you moving forward.
Yeah, I mean, I think the old quote goes, "You're a product of the 5 people that you spend the most time with." So, or you're the average of the person you spend the most time with. But the five, you are the average of the 5 people you spend the most time with. So that was something that I took to heart early on with the friends that I chose, and the classes that I took, the activities that I engaged in, and how I spent my time. Period. And if you are around 3 really good people, but 2 really bad people, like think of it like the curve in a test, right? If a bunch of people or a handful of people get really, really, really bad grades, it brings down the entire curve. So I think people just gotta be more protective of or kids need to be more protective of their time and energy. Realize you don't have to give it to anyone, and being cool is not as important as being a good person. In the moment, being cool might sound good, and being around certain people might make sense. But if they were to ask themselves, if someone that I really wanted to impress was here right now, would I be hanging around with this person doing these things? So I know for me in business, when I left the FBI, I immediately, instead of thinking I'm going to learn how to be the best in the country at this, reading books, I got on planes and I surrounded myself with the best people in the world at what they do, whether I was working with them, learning from them, whether they were athletes or coaches or business professionals. And I felt like if I was in a room and I'm the smartest person in the room, I'm in the wrong room. If I'm the most X person in the room, I'm in the wrong room. So I think kids got to understand that if you want to get to the next level, surround yourself with people that are at or above your level. Doesn't mean that, because there's going to be family members that are not at your level. You can just keep them at an arm's length. There's people that you care about that are your friends that are not at that level or could potentially hold you down. You can respect them, just keep them at an arm's length. But if you ask yourself as a high school athlete or middle school athlete, who are the 5 people I spend the most time with? Are they the type of person that I want to be in 20 years? Are they doing things and encouraging me to do things that lead me closer to or farther from my goals? And that should answer your question, how much time you should spend with them.
Yeah. So when you were growing up, let's talk about when you were growing up. So what made you decide, because you ended up going in and being a collegiate wrestler and doing what you're doing. So there's certain characteristics about, and that's just what I think, there's certain characteristics of, higher level performers, higher level athletes, but a lot of times you don't know about that right away. There's experiences, there's things that happen where you're a young kid that kind of pulls that out. And as well as I do, with those challenges, you have a choice to make, right? You can go complain, blame, that kind of route, or you can say, you know what, I'm going to grab a hold of it, I'm going to move that direction. And those are the ones that end up becoming those higher performers. When you were a young kid, what were there some experiences that you had that made you come to that crossroads and decide, hey, I'm going to go this way, I'm going to go that way, and so on?
Honestly, not to toot my own horn, but I was always a really good kid.
Yeah.
I'll give that to my parents and my coaches. When I was very young, I started wrestling in 2nd grade, and they demanded an extreme amount of discipline. They also, from the first day that I walked in the door, said that you're going to be very good at this and you're very special. And I took that to heart. So I always wanted to make people proud my whole life. So I think the way that I was raised, and then the coaches that I had around me, and then thus the people that I had around me, they were all high performers. In high school, I did not take a single non-advanced or AP class for 4 years. So everyone in my class was someone that cared about school, or at a minimum was smart enough to do well in that class. A good half of us were athletes. So we all had mutual respect for each other for doing the grind of school and the grind of class. And, again, I attribute a lot just to the people that were around me when I was young, but I was always that way. Don't get me wrong. I still have punish all the time. I still mouth off to my mom, but when it came to making ultimately good decisions, I didn't make all the right ones, but I cared about the decisions that I made. And I cared about like the value that I brought to my teams. I cared about my teammates and pouring into others as much as I did myself. So whether part of that was how I was born, the major part of that was how I was raised. I mean, I think there wasn't really anything that made me go down that path besides it's just the way that I always was. I will say, like when I was a junior in high school, I was in New York, so I watched like you could see the smoke from the Twin Towers, even though it was New York City and I was in Long Island. Like you could see that, and that was the day, like September 12th, 2001 was the day that I decided I wanted to be in the FBI. I was going through a career assessment project for my one of my classes, and law enforcement and intelligence analysis and all that stuff was on the radar, but I couldn't really pick what I wanted: doctor, lawyer, this, that, cop, and ultimately that was probably the shift that just made me really want to go that route. So furthermore, when it comes to making decisions, besides the fact that I made decisions just because I made ultimately just cared about the kind of decisions I made because it would reflect on my parents and my coaches and those sort of things. When you want to be in the FBI, like you don't have the opportunity to make bad choices. So at that time, for example, if you wanted to apply to the FBI, you couldn't have smoked weed for 7 years. 7 years. Yeah. So now it's 3 years, right? But it was 7 years with a polygraph, right? You were never allowed to sell any sort of drugs. Immediate disqualification, right? So, I'm not saying I didn't make any mistakes in high school, but I can tell you that after December 31st, 2000, December 31st, what would that been? I guess 2001, that like every decision that I made was made under the assumption of, is this going to further or prohibit my career in the FBI? To include in college when I had opportunities to make bad choices. Is this worth my career? I make one mistake and this could cost me my whole career. Or, I remember, there was a party and some of my teammates were smoking weed and they're like, "Hey, Mike, you want some?" I was like, "Nah, man, I'm good." They're like, "Coach isn't going to drug test us." And I was like, besides the fact that like, I don't want him, like I wouldn't want to fail a drug test. I was like, this isn't worth me restarting the clock of my FBI journey 7 years because I wanted to have fun the night. So if you have really strong goals and you are committed to those goals, then your priorities should be very clear. Doesn't mean you're perfect every day, but you want to be in the FBI, less than 1% of people that apply get in. So I understood that like I didn't even get a tattoo during that time, because I didn't want to have anything that could potentially separate me from the opportunity to get in there. And that was silly for me to think because I got in there and everyone's former military covered in tattoos. But like in my brain, I was like, if I'm going to get selected for some sort of clandestine operation, I don't want any sort of distinguishing marks. So when all my friends were getting tattoos when they were 18, 19, 20, 21, I didn't get any of that stuff.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Well, it's so it starts off with that solid parenting situation where they instill in you to move in a certain direction or be a certain type of person. Now, when you're that young student athlete that doesn't have that and you say, you know what, I'm going to go this direction. A lot of times these kids, they get into the wrong crowd and they end up going the wrong direction. And they are 4 and 5 star kids that can jump out of the building. The best wrestler you've been around, he ended up getting in the wrong path or whatever. Can you pinpoint maybe somebody that you were around for a little bit that ended up going the wrong direction that may have been that guy? You were like, dude, Johnny, those are situations you could always remember as an adult.
I can tell you too. I can tell you a bunch of them. I would say when I was running a wrestling academy, my goal was to build good leaders that are ready to wrestle in college. State championships will come as a byproduct of like them being good people and having the skills ready to wrestle in college. I didn't really care about winning Texas state titles. It wasn't something that was important to me. Yeah, it's good for marketing, but it wasn't something that we were hungry for. Like, we wanted to do well at that tournament, but we had goals that were much bigger than placing in Texas. But yeah, there were two kids particularly. Like, one was probably one of the most like athletically talented kids I ever worked with, but just lacked a lot of the motivation and discipline like outside of that. Had some anger issues and things like that where, we got him almost a full ride into college, and literally all the kid had to do was show up to class, and we couldn't get him to show up to class. Couldn't get him to do his homework. Within a couple of weeks he was home, and then that kid ended up getting mixed up in the wrong crowd, started selling drugs, got arrested, then gets his life clean, and stopped selling and doing a lot of that stuff, but took a bad set of drugs, which we hear about all the time. Took a bad set of drugs, died in his sleep. I had it, and then I had to speak at his funeral. So that was a kid, like, I felt guilty that there was not more that I could have done, but I took comfort in knowing that, like, I bent over backwards for like him and that family for a long time. The kid, the kid needed more therapy than he needed mentorship. Like really, really strong, like trauma type therapy with, maybe things he went through in the beginning of his life. But wrestling did give him an outlet for, especially in high school, where he stayed on the straight and narrow path, created an opportunity for him in college. His parents were both very supportive of what they did, of what he did. And he had a lot of the right circumstances, but again, hung around some of the wrong people. And that ended up, I had to, it was really hard to bury somebody I cared about. And then, fast forward a few years later, just this past year, another kid, world-class talent. I don't want to say world-class, but like very talented. Didn't reach his goals in high school, but because he wasn't a great student, didn't get a lot of opportunities in college. Then he went to college and, realized that like entrepreneurial life was the life for him. I think he graduated from community college, but was so talented, like crazy talented, crazy hard work ethic, super supportive mom. I know his dad's involved, but I don't know to what extent. Like, super supportive mom, coached both him and his sister, and got mixed up in the wrong people, doing the wrong things. And similar to the other guy, got clean and had one bad night, and it didn't go well. So I had to attend his funeral this year too. So that was really hard, right? Like, those are two kids from my like first 2 years of coaching that I poured into them. I coached their younger brother and sister. I've been around their family. We've been out to dinner. Like, I was devastated for both of those. Actually, for the first funeral was in Houston. The second funeral, I was like across the country somewhere and like flew on an overnight flight, drove 2 hours just to show up for an hour, just to show that mom, like, hey, you and your son meant a lot to me in the beginning stages of my time. And I never really knew what the words "pay your respects" like really meant until I went on an overnight flight, drove 2 hours each way just to spend an hour and a half there and then leave. I get the idea of pay the respects, but I was like, I couldn't imagine. She would have been fine with me not coming, but I couldn't imagine not showing up for her when like she and like her family showed up for me so much. But yeah, those are two kids that got mixed up with the wrong people that had all the talent in the world and had two very supportive, they had supportive families, and just did not, because of who they surrounded themselves with, did not go down the right path.
Yeah. Talk about choices, the choices you do have and the choices that you actually do make. Like, when you put your
so we can't control what happens to us, but we can 100% control how we respond. So the issue, and where mindset training becomes so important for athletes, is that like, you as an athlete are in control of how you respond. That does not mean that you have the tools to do so amidst difficult situations. Even if you're tough, even if you are talented, unless you are taught a process and a system of how to control your emotions, then in difficult moments you're just relying on biting down on your mouthpiece and hoping you can figure it out. There's no process to do it. When we invest our money, there's a process. When we learn how to get strong, there's a process. When we learn how to get fast, there's a process. But kids are never really taught. They're given some advice, but ultimately, like, advice is like, imagine if you just gave advice on getting strong, but you didn't actually go to the gym. You didn't have a strength coach to get you there. So that's why mindset's so important. We learn about photosynthesis in school. We learn about the Byzantine Empire.
Yeah.
We learn how many hydrogen molecules are in water, but we don't know how to resolve conflict, do our taxes, or communicate effectively. And that's what I realized, and one of the reasons I left the FBI. I was like, I always wanted a career in sports, and I thought it was going to be like in the tactical part of wrestling. And then I realized that I can make a lot bigger of an impact. And the biggest need is to fill this void, which is teaching athletes mental skills to become the best version of themselves.
Yeah. So as a kid decides, hey, this is what I want to do, got a good surrounding, overcoming a lot of different things, decent athlete, but not getting these offers and not getting what they think that they're getting. Talk about ego and going from being in this situation where you're a high school wrestler, you're a high school athlete. Talk about ego, because now we're in a situation where these kids you can kind of skate by in most sports. Let's be honest. You can be the best on the team, never have to go through any adversity, never really have to do it. Talk about ego, man. Like, I think that's one thing that really holds a lot of kids back from pursuing that dream too, because they think that they're better than they are, right?
Yeah.
They think that there's more to it.
Unfortunately, that's just a product of society, and it's not going to go away. Through social media, and the evolution of I won't say the evolution, like the de-evolution of a lot of like society's culture. What is it? Hard times build tough men. Tough men make easy times. Easy times make weak men. Weak men make hard times. So we're in that weak men make hard times stage. However many years ago, 18-year-old men were getting drafted to war, no choice, right? A couple hundred years ago, like everyone of age is going to fight and likely, very, very, very likely die. And you're like, all right, yep, gotta do it. Now we have kids flipping teachers off, punching teachers in the face, and coaches that can't run their teams because of the booster club's political influence. Now, mind you, there are a lot of coaches that abuse their power in their authority, like in dealing with the high schoolers, that have caused people to make rules, which is great. But yeah, man, there's ego is never going to go away. It's just a matter of how well you choose to deal with it. We all have it. Like ego is the natural reaction to respond to things. But, entitlement is birthed by ego. Victim mentality is birthed by ego. Anything that is me is birthed by ego. So you want a kid to not have ego, raise him right, make him sure he has no bad friends, surrounds himself with the right people, be protective of the coaches that he has, be careful of how you act. And that's the only way to really combat ego. But if I were to say the best athletes are the ones that have the least amount of ego, not all of them, right? There's the Conor McGregors of the world, but the most successful athletes, they are always trying to learn. They operate from a place of gratitude. They are more thankful for the opportunity to X than they care about the outcomes or what other people may think. They pour into others more. So if we want to work through ego, it comes through parenting. And unfortunately, parenting is not at a great place this generation either. It's a war out there, man. It's a battle. It's a battle. That's why I think people like me and people like me in my program should be in every school in the country. There should be a curriculum on how to teach mindfulness starting at kindergarten and then progressively getting more advanced as it goes on.
Yeah. Well, when I think of ego, I think of a couple things. I think one thing that really can at least, can harbor that are experiences or going through experiences, right? So being put in positions where you have to decide, do I keep that ego or do I not? When we talk about wrestling, I always use that as an example because when I was wrestling in high school and also when I was fighting, when you get into deep waters and you have nothing left, there's no such thing as ego. They're just, if you're treading water, I had to tread water. So I was about 220 pounds in college, and I had to take a swimming class. And to pass the swimming class, I had to tread water for 5 minutes. And that class and that exercise taught me more than I could imagine,
Yes.
because listen, Mike, I had to be right next to the wall. There's no way. I'm like, first of all, once everything is gone, it's gone, Jack, and I'm hitting the bottom,
Yeah.
and nobody's coming to save me because I was big. And and the thing is the professor also made us be in a certain part of the water, like the pool. There
Right.
wasn't no, you know what I'm saying, tippy toes, nothing. So, talk a little bit about experiences and how we can deal with a kid's ego, because coming from at least the football, basketball, those bigger sports, it may be in wrestling, but wrestling, you're put in those situations all the time to where wrestling practice is something beyond. There's nobody to save you in a wrestling practice. So,
Yeah.
when it comes
if
to
everybody could wrestle and wait tables, we'd probably have a lot less ego.
Yeah.
I think that's something that should be required, as well as, like I said, a mindfulness curriculum. Because previously, when we were younger, you threw a kid into sports and he learned life skills. That's no longer the case. Yes, it happens. Like it does happen, but because the culture of sports and the culture of like our country has changed, you're not just guaranteed life skills. If anything, a lot of kids will build bad habits playing sports because they're surrounded by a bunch of other people with bad habits, who cut corners, who, we have coaches that are afraid to coach because they can't yell at kids. And, in some states, you can't use physical punishment. You can't use like conditioning as a physical punishment anymore. And again, some coaches took it too far. Kids have died. And I understand the boundaries, but experiences dealing with ego. I mean, ultimately, in a perfect world, like, you would need to get these kids when they're young and coach them up from when they're young. The best high school programs I'm around, the high school coaches are intimately connected into the youth program, and the youth program, from the coach says, this is our vision for what we want these kids in high school. So this is how we're going to implement this vision in our like youth program, then in our middle school program, so that when they get to the high school program, they know exactly what to expect. These are the expectations of the coaches, the kids, the parents. This is the culture. This is this is the that. That's the only way that you can minimize, but never like protect yourself from ego. Realistically, when you get a kid in 9th grade for the first time, you are inheriting all his past experiences, coaching, trauma, all that sort of stuff. So it's just got to be like a hard set of ground rules. I just tell coaches, like, make contracts, make it super clear as to what you expect from your players. And, I'm not necessarily saying the 3 strikes rule type of thing, but, there are rules and boundaries. There are non-negotiables. We do not do these things. And if you do these things, then like you will be counseled the first time, like have a consequence the second time, and then the third time you're off the team. So if kids are not given an option to be selfish, if kids are not given an option to play a victim, if kids are not given an option to do certain things, and then as a leader, you walk that walk and talk that talk. And furthermore, you've created a set of players that exemplify these characteristics. Well, the best teams, they are player-led. They're not coach-fed, right? So that was from University of Texas when they upset Georgia a couple of years ago, after they got rid of Mac Brown. They're like, man, how'd you pull it off? They're like, this is the first time I've had a player-led team. And these guys are running the show. They're the one taking care of the culture and the problems. Like, I'm just calling plays and recruiting. I handle stuff when it gets to the top. So moral of the story is that, like, culturally, you just got to create a place where there's non-negotiables, but you can't lead with fear. You got to make kids like love the sport, love their team, and put the team and the sport above their ego. And again, you can't do that in this generation without having like hard rules, but you got to create a culture where kids want to come to practice, where kids want to get better, where kids love the sport, but you also coach them hard too. Love them first, coach them hard second. Everybody coaches them hard and then like, oh man, I love you though. Like, love them first, pour into them as people, make them love the sport, then you can coach them hard. Dabo Swinney says that all the time.
Yeah, you know what? That's a really good point. And you can define it in just one word, really, and it's those expectations. So I think one of the best experiences I ever had was I worked as a teacher for a long time, and I went and worked with a K through 8. Oh yeah, you should add that. Maybe you should add that to what you were saying earlier. You're a waiter, you're all those different things. Then you should be a teacher, like at a K through 8, bro, especially the lowest kindergarten through maybe like 4th grade, because I was a PE teacher. That's another one. That's another beast in itself, because these kids have been sitting behind a desk all day. You know what I'm saying? When it's PE time, it's time to just lose their minds. And so I spent like 2 or 3 weeks just getting them to stand in a straight line without actually hitting their, So,
but imagine though, let's say Jocko Willing comes in and runs PE class. You think anyone's going to run around?
No. Yeah.
No. So that's and is he going to be a jerk to them and scream at them like it's boot camp? I mean, he could, and that would probably work. But ultimately, when you lead with fear, then people just do things behind your back. So, anyone that knows Jocko, they think of him as this super serious guy. But I'm actually drinking my Jocko Fuel right now. I do work with their company. I'm kind of like their fight sports liaison for their nutrition company, and Jocko, if you know any of his leadership speakings, it's all about team. It's all about loving the guys and girls that are on your team. There's so many things that are on an emotional level. Point being is that from the moment that people walk in, when they realize that I care about you, so I'm not calling you out, I'm calling you up, but there are standards. And if you do not meet these standards, these are the consequences. There's no gray area. We do or we don't. It is black or it is white. You stop or you go. Because there's certain teachers that you can walk into their classes and it's not a compliment to one or the other. It's just having coached high schoolers and young kids. I know what you're saying, and it's messy. But I've also gone into wrestling rooms where there's 150 kids. My buddy, rest in peace, probably the greatest youth wrestling coach of all time. His name's Mike Krause. And dude, he ran a room of a couple hundred kids. Not a single person talked. You know why? The second somebody talked, he called them out, made them do push-ups in front of everybody. But he led with leadership and love and intensity. Everyone wanted to be there. He was a clinician. So within 20 minutes, he had 150 kids of different age levels and experience levels listening. They would learn. They'd actually get the move. One of the saddest things about him dying is that we didn't get to share him with the rest of the world. Yeah. He was the best teacher, motivator, in a short-term in and out basis I have ever seen. I learned a lot from him. So anyway, sorry. Didn't mean to interrupt.
No, you're good. No, and expectations. When I talk to coaches, I go to clinics, I interact with all these guys, I go watch practices, whatever. And then also being in the classroom, expectations you can tell are not there. What I should do is I should go to every school at the beginning of every class, every semester, and see what these professors and teachers, as far as their expectations, because
let me say something to that before you go forward. Let me say something to that. This is something I talk about a lot. So this is where the high, when you get to a high level of sports, we have to change our lingo. So the reason back in the day, we were afraid of authority. Now we are taught to question authority. So expectations breed authority, and they also breed weight. What if I don't live up to them? You know what I have my people do? What are the standards and what are your standards and values? So as a competitor, what are your standards and values? It's easy to live up to standards. Expectations are very heavy. So either someone's afraid to not live up to expectations or the consequences of, or they don't like the idea of expectations because who the hell are you? You're just some teacher. I'm going to take your class for a semester. I'm just what are you going to do? And I think telling people to, and again, this goes back to think of the most successful football programs. Let's think of, Alabama football. Let's think of Clemson football when they were killing Alabama for those years. They are value-based program. They are standards. They don't have expectations because they know that expectations is something in the future. We want to win. We like winning, and you could say that like our expectations is to be able to put ourselves in a position to win a national championship, but they get there by living up to their standards and values. Kids can get down with standards and values. Athletes can get down with standards and values. These are the values of our team, and I take them more seriously than any game that we win or points that we score, anything like that. So why is it that like certain teams can do that and other teams can't? So at a high level, Penn State's won 11 out of 13 straight national titles. They broke the points record this year for NCAAs. His brother, Kale's brother, is one of my mentors. We picked each other's brains for many years. He always talks about like one of the reasons Kale gets so much out of his guys is that he cares about them so much more than he does about wrestling. But that's backed up by all of his actions. You go to his house, you don't know that he's an Olympic champion. You don't even know that he wrestled. If you didn't look at his cauliflower ear, you would never know. Jesus and his family are the only things on the wall. His Olympic gold medal's in a drawer somewhere, right? When he brings a guy into his office, it's how you doing, man? Like, how's school? How's that girl you've been seeing? They live and die by those values. And a lot of us talk about stuff, but we act a different way. So, again, like these are the things that I've learned at the highest of levels where the teams, like you could talk about gratitude all day. Do all of your leaders on your team, athletes, leadership athletes, seniors, juniors, and your coaches, do they walk that walk too? And the teams that have dynasty success do.
Yeah. So I know you got to run, but listen, I'm going to ask you one question. I got to put you on the hot seat after that. So last question. What are the keys to success as from a coach's perspective?
Yeah, well, I'm glad. I was actually going to say this anyway, but culture eats talent for breakfast. Don't focus on building talent. Focus on building culture. Focus on building culture while you teach them skills. That's like the biggest key to success in the highest level of sports. So if it works at the highest level to win championships in the world and NCAA level, then those teams that are winning 10 state titles in high school, it's the same difference for them. Like they built a tradition and a culture, not just of winning, but of excellence. So if you can identify like, okay, what are the 3 values that I want my team to represent? Each one of those kids have 3 values that they want to represent. If they live and train and compete by those values, and you're good at teaching what you need to do, then they're probably going to enjoy their experience, which means they're going to work harder, which means they're going to do better, which means they're going to learn more, which means you're going to score more, which means they're going to win more. Everybody talks about culture, but then they do physical training. You have to do things to actively build culture, which is why people like me are so present in professional sports. And in college sports, you have to do things regularly to build culture. You don't talk about culture at the parent meeting and the first thing of the year and then yell at them about culture or talk to them in your like post-practice talks. You have to actively do things to build culture and protect the culture at all costs. That's the biggest things for winning. If I could give you 4 pillars of an athlete that I give my people, you need to be grateful, you need to be resilient, you need to be intentional, you need to be totally committed. I call that having grit. So if you have grit, if you're more excited to compete than you care about winning and losing, you're resilient, meaning you're not just tough, you're adaptable to adversity, you're intentional, you have a plan for practice, you evaluate practice, you do everything with purpose, and you're totally committed, like to your team over yourself and to the process over your podium. If you can do those things as an individual, you can be successful. If you can build that in a team, you'll be successful. You pair that with building your culture with the same effort that you build your X's and O's, you'll be successful.
I love it. All right. So listen, hey, I got to put you on the hot seat. So, all right. So listen, so you're from the East Coast, right? You spent some time in Maryland. Now you're on the West Coast. So you're from one coast to the next. So question number 1, crab cakes or fish tacos?
Crab cakes, 100%.
What makes it? I've never had a crab cake before. What makes it so good?
Well, you have to get a good one. Don't get one at a place that's not known for crab cakes. Actually, Eddie V's in downtown San Diego is great crab cakes. Highly recommend. Crab is a delicious meat and something that's like lightly fried and like has a little bit of. It's the texture, it's the taste. Like if you like fish, you like lobster, you like shrimp, you like stuff like that, you love crab cakes. And you can put it on a sandwich, you can cut up eat them yourself, you can put it in salads, money.
Well, I'm from the Northwest, so I've had crab, but I've never, the crab cake aspect. There's got to be some way you cook it a little bit differently.
Yes.
Yeah. So, all right. So listen, so cutting weight, question number 2. So what's more difficult, cutting weight or passing a polygraph?
Ooh, that's a great question. I mean, if you're telling the truth, passing a polygraph isn't too hard. But I will say that what's more stressful is passing a polygraph because you're so afraid of they track your perspiration, they track your fidgeting. Like I'm afraid to not pass polygraph because I'm afraid to not pass. I'm just afraid to give false indications that I'm saying something wrong. You know what I mean? So you're stressed about not what you're going to say, but am I fidgeting too much? Like my whole career goes down to this. If you fail a polygraph, you're blacklisted. More stressful. I'll cut weight any day versus having to take the polygraph.
All right. So question number 3, what would you say is more difficult? So public speaking or an important wrestling match?
It's a great question. I mean, I think everything comes down to your skills. But when you think about it, what made me a great wrestler is one of the things that made me a great wrestler is one of the things that makes me a great public speaker is that I love to perform. So I don't feel like it was the same thing when I would give class presentations. If I was in a group, I was unanimously elected to present literally everything that I've ever been a part of in a group since I was 10 years old, right? I was the speaker for the FBI graduation, unanimously elected by my class. I like to perform. This is one of the reasons why this job is fun for me. So when it comes to harder, I would say it's harder to win a wrestling match because you have to fight somebody else. So there's things that you can't control. But if you like to perform, you should equitably enjoy each. I probably would enjoy the wrestling match more because I love the feeling of making somebody quit under my hands and watch their body language change. So that's why I like jiu-jitsu. It's very satisfying to make a grown man say I quit.
Yeah. So question number 4, who's harder to deal with, parents or a boss in the FBI?
Very subjective, but on a general level, I would say parents. Parents because they're emotionally invested in their kids and have their own opinions and just the way that culture is. Don't get me wrong, I've had some of the best parents in sports ever, and I love them. One of the kids I work with at Ohio State, I literally drove 2 hours just to go meet his parents because I appreciate his parents so much and had dinner with him and his family. But parents are definitely more difficult than a boss. There are some very difficult bosses. I probably had the toughest boss in the entire FBI when I got in for my first 3 years, and he's one of 2 people to ever break me in my entire life. I'm stronger for it, but people in the FBI are at a high level. So your boss should probably understand things at a different level, and you can communicate a little bit more effectively. Still difficult. I'd rather deal with my FBI difficult bosses than with an unreasonable parent because they're emotionally confused about what their kid is doing or not doing. But again, all you parents out there, as a dad of an 11-year-old and being around lots of parents as a coach, I know this job's hard. I don't take it personal. But y'all are not the easiest to deal with sometimes. I'm sure we're not the easiest to deal with either. But yeah, parents are hard.
Yeah. 5th and final question. If there's one thing you could do over again, what would you do through your career as an athlete?
Through my career as an athlete, I would have wrestled more freestyle and Greco in high school. I also, private lessons wasn't a thing when I was a kid. I wish I knew that we can do private lessons. I wish I just knew what I knew now about what makes someone great. I just worked really hard at practice. I went to club a couple times a week. I thought I was doing the extra, competed some more. I would probably take the off season really serious, not just I trained a couple days a week. I went to a couple tournaments. Now when I run an academy or coach these kids, you're not competing 3 times this month. You're not going to this tournament. I didn't even know what Fargo was when I was in high school, and now I coach people in the finals there every year. I wish I knew about private training, one-on-one training, and valued freestyle and Greco more, because it definitely would have made me better as a wrestler.
Yeah. So listen, Mindset Mike, thank you so much for being on the podcast. I really appreciate it. It means a whole lot to me and obviously the viewers. Guys, make sure and check him out at the unfairadvantagemindset.com, Twitter, Facebook. What else are you on, Mike? Go ahead and plug it for me.
Instagram's the main thing. I don't post on Twitter much, which sucks because Joe Rogan follows me on Twitter. Really wish I can get some traction on Twitter. Maybe Joe would see more of my posts. But yeah, I would say Instagram's the best way. I kind of share extra on Facebook. It's more of my personal friends and stuff like that. But Instagram's the best way. Mindset_Mike. I post a lot of content, give a lot of stuff away. It's your opportunity to connect with me most, for sure. Or check out the website if you're interested in more training, unfairadvantagemindset.com.
Well, listen, he's the man for the job. If you guys have any questions or you guys may be interested in getting involved with what he's got going on, listen, definitely reach out. Listen, hey, also subscribe to the channel Walk On Warrior podcast. Like I said, we're posting content every single day. We're knocking out at least one podcast a week, and we're just going to keep this thing rolling. And listen, this is how I always like to finish out the podcast. I always like to say that, you young student athletes and parents, always remember it's not about us. It's about you guys. Thanks, guys.